Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit the subscribe button. Now, let me ask you a question. Have you ever seen someone being treated unfairly and thought, I wish I could help them? What if the person who needed help wasn't someone you'd expect? What if they were completely ignored by others? And what if, just maybe, they were more powerful than anyone knew? It was just another regular day on the flight. Everyone was busy. The plane was full, and the flight attendants were working hard, walking up and down the aisles. They gave out drinks, snacks, and helped passengers get settled in. Some were talking with the passengers, some were just trying to get through the long flight, doing their jobs as best as they could. But there was one passenger who was sitting quietly, unnoticed by most. She wasn't complaining, wasn't asking for much, and didn't make any noise. She was simply looking out the window, waiting for her drink. But soon, she would become the center of attention. And not in the way anyone expected. Her name was Mrs. Evelyn Morris. She was an older lady, calm and patient. She sat near the window, a small smile on her face as she looked out over the clouds. She wasn't in a hurry, and she wasn't upset. She simply raised her hand when she needed something. She was waiting for some water. Just water. Nothing special. But when the young flight attendant, Jenny, walked down the aisle, she passed by Mrs. Morris without even looking at her. Jenny, who was busy, barely glanced at the elderly woman. She didn't stop at her row. Mrs. Morris raised her hand politely, but Jenny didn't stop. She kept walking down the aisle, looking ahead, paying no attention to the woman sitting by the window. Mrs. Morris waited. She thought, maybe the young lady didn't see me, and so she raised her hand a little higher. She didn't want to make a fuss, just needed a glass of water. But Jenny didn't stop. She kept going. It wasn't a big deal at first. But it was a little rude. And sometimes, small things like this can set off big changes. Jenny didn't know it, but she had just made a decision that would change everything. All because she didn't stop to help the elderly woman. Mrs. Morris was not someone who could be ignored forever. And the reason why would soon become clear. What Jenny didn't know was that Mrs. Morris wasn't just any passenger. She wasn't just an old woman traveling by plane. Mrs. Morris had a secret that no one on that flight could have ever guessed. She was someone important. Very important. The simple fact that Jenny had ignored her, even after Mrs. Morris had raised her hand politely, would lead to something none of them could have ever imagined. Jenny, who had been rushing around, did not think twice about her actions. She had other passengers to worry about, and in her eyes, Mrs. Morris wasn't as urgent as the others. She was just another passenger. One who was probably asleep, not needing anything. Jenny didn't know it, but her careless move was about to change her whole life. And so, there was Mrs. Morris, sitting quietly by the window, waiting for a glass of water. Jenny passed her by. But what was coming next would make everyone stop and pay attention. Mrs. Morris didn't get upset. She simply sat back in her seat, looking out the window. She wasn't angry. She didn't shout. She didn't even tap the flight attendant on the shoulder. She just waited. And as the minutes passed, Jenny continued to rush up and down the aisles, serving passengers and making sure everything was running smoothly. The plane was crowded. It was one of those busy flights where everyone seemed to need something at the same time. But Jenny couldn't have known that Mrs. Morris wasn't the kind of passenger to just sit quietly. She was, in fact, a woman of great importance, but no one on the plane knew that yet. Mrs. Morris had seen this kind of thing before. People like Jenny Young, new at their jobs, rushing around sometimes forgot to notice the people who didn't stand out. But Mrs. Morris had learned a long time ago to be patient. She knew her turn would come, eventually. But that didn't mean she had to like being treated this way. It wasn't right, and she knew it. If Jenny had only taken a moment to stop and look at Mrs. Morris, she would have seen someone who was different from the rest of the passengers. Mrs. Morris wasn't loud. She wasn't demanding. But she had a way about her that made people pay attention when the time was right. Mrs. Morris wasn't used to being ignored. In fact, she had worked hard her whole life to make sure people didn't overlook her. People in her past had made that mistake before, underestimating her because of her age, her appearance, or the quiet way she carried herself. They didn't realize that she had more power, more influence, than they could ever imagine. But today, on this flight, Jenny made that mistake. And she would soon learn just how costly it could be to underestimate Mrs. Morris. Jenny continued on, stopping at the other rows, offering drinks, answering questions, and dealing with the usual flight issues. She never looked back at Mrs. Morris, who was still sitting there, calmly waiting. By now, other passengers were noticing what was happening. They saw the older woman's polite hand raised, and they saw Jenny walk right past her. Some passengers whispered to each other, wondering why the flight attendant had ignored the elderly lady. But no one said anything out loud. It wasn't their place. And still, Mrs. Morris sat quietly, her hand still raised. She wasn't upset. She wasn't causing a scene. She just waited. And waited. She knew what was coming. She knew it wouldn't be long before Jenny would realize what had happened. But it was going to take a little while longer. Jenny, meanwhile, was getting more and more flustered. As she moved up and down the aisle, she could feel the weight of the passengers' stares. She could feel the tension in the air, but she didn't know why. She was just doing her job. Everything was fine. Nothing was wrong. And then, the plane began to make an announcement. "Attention, passengers," the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "We will be experiencing some turbulence in about 15 minutes, so please remain in your seats with your seat belts fastened." The announcement made everyone a little nervous, but it was nothing too serious. Turbulence was common on flights, and most people had experienced it before. Jenny, however, was feeling more and more stressed. The turbulence would only make her job harder. She already had a lot to do, and now she would need to make sure everyone was safe during the bumpy ride. But in the midst of all the chaos, one thing was becoming clearer and clearer: Jenny had ignored Mrs. Morris. And she didn't know what would happen next. Minutes later, Jenny made her way back down the aisle, carrying a tray with drinks for a few of the passengers. As she passed Mrs. Morris' row again, she noticed something different. Mrs. Morris was sitting up straighter now, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There was a quiet confidence about her, something that hadn't been there before. Jenny stopped in front of her. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Jenny asked, trying to sound professional, though she still felt uneasy. Mrs. Morris smiled softly. "Yes, dear. I would like some water, please." Jenny nodded and grabbed a glass of water from the tray. She handed it to Mrs. Morris, who accepted it with a polite nod. But there was something about the way Mrs. Morris took the glass that made Jenny pause. The elderly woman's fingers were delicate, but there was strength in them. It was a strange thing to notice, but it stuck with Jenny. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. "Thank you," Mrs. Morris said quietly, taking a sip of the water. Jenny smiled back and turned to walk away, but as she did, she felt a tap on her shoulder. "Excuse me," Mrs. Morris said. "I think there is something you need to know." Jenny stopped and turned back. Her heart skipped a beat. Was something wrong? Did she make a mistake again? Had she missed something else? "I'm sorry," Jenny said quickly. "What was that, ma'am?" Mrs. Morris leaned in just a little bit closer, her eyes locking with Jenny's. For a moment, the rest of the plane seemed to disappear. Jenny felt a strange sense of unease, like she was in the presence of someone important. "I don't think you realize who I am," Mrs. Morris said, her voice calm and steady. Jenny blinked. "I'm sorry. What do you mean? You're just a passenger, right?" Mrs. Morris smiled again, but this time, there was a sharpness to it. I think you need to sit down and listen carefully, dear. You might want to understand who I really am before you make another mistake. Jenny's stomach twisted. What was going on? Was Mrs. Morris mad at her? Was she going to complain to the airline? But what Mrs. Morris said next would shake Jenny to her core. I own this airline, she said softly. For a second, Jenny just stared at her. She thought she must have heard wrong. How could that be? This elderly woman, this quiet, patient woman owned the airline? No way. Mrs. Morris sat back in her seat, waiting for Jenny's reaction. And Jenny, still in shock, had no idea what to say. Let's turn the spotlight on Jenny for a moment. Jenny was new to the job. She had only been working as a flight attendant for a few months. This was her first real job after finishing school, and she was excited. But Jenny wasn't just excited, she was also nervous. She wanted to do well. She wanted to show everyone that she could handle the job, even though she was still learning. Every day, she faced challenges. There was always something that went wrong. A passenger would be rude. A drink cart would get stuck. There were always things that would go wrong, and Jenny had to fix them quickly. It wasn't easy, especially on busy flights like this one. Jenny had a lot of pressure on her shoulders. Her manager, Sarah, was tough. She expected everything to be perfect. But the real challenge came from her supervisor, Dave. Dave was always watching. He was the one who would give Jenny feedback after every flight, and it wasn't always nice feedback. You're here to do a job, Dave had told her when she started. The customer comes first. Always. If you don't make the passengers happy, you won't be here long. Jenny remembered those words every time she served passengers. She thought about them when she passed by someone who needed help. It was hard. She wanted to do her best, but sometimes, she didn't know how to make everyone happy. Today was one of those days. The flight was busy. Everyone wanted something, and Jenny had to make sure that everyone got what they wanted. She moved quickly up and down the aisles, checking on the passengers, giving out snacks and drinks, and making sure the flight was going smoothly. There were younger passengers who asked for extra drinks. There were families with children who needed attention. There were people with special requests. Jenny tried to get to everyone. She wanted to do her best. But it wasn't always easy. As Jenny walked down the aisle, she noticed some passengers were more active. Some waved at her, some called her name. Some were younger and needed more care. There were a few people in the back who needed more help than Mrs. Morris. The elderly woman had raised her hand for water, but Jenny was in a hurry. She thought to herself, I'll come back to her. She's just an old woman sitting there quietly. The others need me more. So, she passed Mrs. Morris without stopping. She gave a quick glance at her and moved on. She had to keep going. There were other passengers to attend to. The flight was full, and there were only so many things Jenny could do at once. She had already given water to the row behind Mrs. Morris. Why stop again? But what Jenny didn't know was that she had made a mistake. It wasn't a big mistake, but it was still a mistake. Mrs. Morris wasn't just any old lady. She was someone who had been overlooked before. She had been treated like she didn't matter. But in that moment, she was watching Jenny closely. Mrs. Morris had a way of observing things, and she didn't miss a thing. As Jenny continued to move down the aisle, she didn't notice the eyes of Mrs. Morris. Those eyes were calm, but sharp. Mrs. Morris had seen it all before. She had seen younger people like Jenny rushing around, making mistakes, thinking they were too busy for the small things. But Mrs. Morris wasn't angry. She wasn't upset. She just smiled a little, a small, knowing smile. She knew what was coming next. Jenny didn't know it yet, but she had just triggered something. It wasn't a huge mistake, but it was a mistake. And the more Jenny tried to prove herself, the more she started to forget what really mattered, being kind, paying attention to everyone, not just the loudest or the busiest people. It wasn't long before Jenny realized something was wrong. The passengers had started whispering. They were talking about how Jenny had passed by Mrs. Morris without stopping. Some passengers had even given Jenny confused looks. But Jenny didn't know. She didn't see the way the other passengers were watching. She was focused on doing her job, just trying to make sure everything went smoothly. But she was missing something important. In her rush to serve everyone, she had forgotten about the one person who needed her most. And that person was Mrs. Morris. Jenny was getting tired. The flight had been going on for hours. She had been running up and down the aisles, carrying drinks, offering snacks, and making sure everyone was comfortable. Some passengers were happy, but others seemed upset. Jenny was trying her best, but she could feel the pressure mounting. She kept thinking about Dave's words, "The customer comes first." She had to make sure everyone was happy. She couldn't afford to let anyone complain. Jenny knew that if someone complained about her, it could be bad for her job. She didn't want to lose it. This was her first real job, and she needed to keep proving herself. She glanced at Mrs. Morris Rowe again. The older woman was still sitting quietly by the window. She had finished her water, and now she was just staring out at the clouds. She wasn't making a scene. She wasn't demanding anything. But something about the way she was sitting made Jenny feel uneasy. Was Mrs. Morris upset? Did she feel ignored? Jenny didn't know. But she couldn't stop now. She had more passengers to help. There were still people calling her name, asking for things, needing her attention. Jenny tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. As the flight went on, Jenny's nerves started to get the best of her. She made a few small mistakes. She forgot to offer water to a family. She missed a passenger's snack order. She was starting to get overwhelmed. But she couldn't let anyone see that. She had to keep going. She had to keep moving. And then, the turbulence started. The plane shook a little, and some of the passengers gasped. Jenny grabbed the armrest, trying to keep steady. She knew what to do. She had trained for this. She quickly told the passengers to stay in their seats and buckle up. But in the middle of the chaos, she realized that the thing she had been avoiding, her mistake with Mrs. Morris, was still hanging over her. She glanced back down the aisle toward Mrs. Morris. This time, the elderly woman wasn't just sitting quietly. She was watching Jenny carefully. Her eyes were steady, but there was a hint of something in them. Jenny couldn't tell what it was: concern? Disappointment? Or maybe just patience? Whatever it was, it made Jenny nervous. She couldn't help but feel like she had failed. She had been so focused on proving herself to everyone else, on making sure the louder passengers got their drinks, that she had forgotten about the one person who hadn't asked for anything at all. Mrs. Morris didn't complain. She didn't yell. She didn't even wave for attention. But she had been paying attention to everything. She had seen how Jenny rushed around, trying to please everyone, without really seeing the people who needed her most. And that's when it hit Jenny. It wasn't about how fast she could go. It wasn't about making sure everyone was satisfied immediately. It was about being present. It was about noticing the people who might get overlooked. It was about slowing down and making sure no one felt invisible. Jenny's hands started to shake slightly as she walked back down the aisle. The plane had smoothed out, and passengers had stopped worrying about the turbulence. But Jenny was still distracted. She kept thinking about Mrs. Morris and how she had missed her. How she had ignored someone who deserved more than that. She had been so eager to prove herself, so focused on keeping up with the job, that she had missed the point. The point wasn't about rushing. The point wasn't about satisfying the loudest or busiest passengers. The point was about treating everyone with respect. Jenny had heard people say that before, but she hadn't truly understood what it meant. She thought that being a flight attendant was all about running around and meeting needs quickly. But now, she was realizing that it was more than that. It was about connection. It was about noticing the quiet ones, the ones who didn't make noise or ask for much. They needed attention, too. And as Jenny moved closer to Mrs. Morris Rowe again, she felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She had made a mistake, but it wasn't too late to fix it. She could still make it right. She could still offer Mrs. Morris the attention she deserved. Jenny felt a deep breath leave her chest as she stopped in front of Mrs. Morris. Her nerves were still there, but she pushed them aside. This wasn't about her. This was about Mrs. Morris, the elderly woman who had quietly observed everything. Mrs. Morris looked up at Jenny, and for the first time, there was no judgment in her eyes. Only calm. Only understanding. Jenny smiled at her and said softly, "I'm sorry. Can I get you anything else?" Mrs. Morris nodded, her faint smile still on her lips. "Just some more water, dear." This time, Jenny didn't hesitate. She immediately reached for the drink cart and grabbed a fresh glass of water for the elderly woman. It wasn't about rushing this time. It was about taking the time to care. The flight continued smoothly, but something in the air had changed. Jenny could feel it, even if she wasn't sure why. It wasn't the usual busy feeling that came with serving passengers. There was a tension in the air that seemed to make her hands shake just a little more every time she served a drink or passed through the aisles. Jenny had been working hard all day, doing her best to keep the passengers happy, but as the hours went by, she couldn't help but feel like something wasn't right. She didn't know exactly what it was, but there was a feeling, like a chill, that hung over her every time she went back to the front of the plane. Her supervisor, Dave, had been keeping a very close eye on her since the moment they took off. She could feel his gaze whenever she passed by, watching her every move. He hadn't said much, but his look was enough to make her nervous. Jenny hated that feeling, being watched all the time, especially when she was trying so hard to do everything right. It wasn't just Dave either. The other flight attendants had started to act different around her. Whenever Jenny walked by, she could feel their eyes on her, but not in a friendly way. It wasn't like the usual smiles or small talk they shared during breaks. No, this time they seemed to exchange quick glances, talking in whispers when they thought Jenny wasn't paying attention. At first, Jenny thought maybe she was just being paranoid. After all, she was new to the job, and maybe she was just nervous about making mistakes. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more the whispers grew louder, and the stares became harder to ignore. And then, Dave spoke up. He didn't ask, he didn't gently offer advice. No, he snapped at her, his voice harsh and cold. "Why did you ignore that woman?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing at her as they made their way down the aisle. His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to catch the attention of the other attendants, who all seemed to pause and listen. Jenny felt her heart drop into her stomach. She had tried her best all day, and she had been rushing to serve so many passengers. She had made a mistake with Mrs. Morris, yes. She knew that. But was it really such a big deal? Was her entire performance on the line because of one small mistake? She felt a lump form in her throat. I didn't mean to ignore her, Dave," Jenny said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. She didn't want to sound like she was making excuses, but she also didn't want to be yelled at. She wanted to be better. She wanted to show everyone that she could do this job. "I just had a lot to do," and she didn't seem to mind. Dave didn't seem to care about her explanation. "You're here to serve everyone, Jenny," he snapped again. "It doesn't matter who they are or how quiet they are. You're not here to pick and choose who gets what. You do your job properly, or we won't have you here long." "Got it." Jenny nodded, but the words hit her hard. It wasn't just about serving drinks or handing out snacks. It was about treating every passenger, no matter who they were, with respect. Jenny had tried so hard to keep up with everything, but she'd missed something important. And now, she wasn't sure if she could fix it. Her heart sank as she walked back to the drink cart. The weight of Dave's words hung heavy on her shoulders. Was she really that bad at her job? She knew she wasn't perfect, but she did try. She worked hard. Why couldn't he see that? But still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. She couldn't stop wondering if it was just her job performance that was being judged. Maybe, just maybe, there was something else happening. Something she didn't understand yet. Meanwhile, as Jenny tried to shake off the tension, she noticed Mrs. Morris again. The elderly woman had been quiet the entire flight, just sitting by the window, but now, she was starting to attract some attention from the other passengers. Jenny wasn't sure why, but it seemed like more and more people were looking at Mrs. Morris, some whispering to each other, others just staring. Jenny couldn't help but wonder what was going on. Why was everyone suddenly so curious about Mrs. Morris? She was just an elderly woman sitting in her seat, waiting for her water. But there was something about her presence that seemed to make people pay attention. It wasn't obvious, but Jenny noticed that whenever she passed by Mrs. Morris' row, the passengers sitting near her seemed to glance at her more often. It was as if they were waiting for something, watching her closely. At first, Jenny thought it was just her imagination. But as the flight went on, the curiosity about Mrs. Morris grew. Passengers would turn their heads to look at her, and Jenny could swear she saw a few people nodding to each other like they recognized something. But what was it? It didn't make sense. Mrs. Morris hadn't caused any trouble. She hadn't even asked for anything extra. She had quietly waited for her water and had sat there like any other passenger. Yet there was something about her that was drawing attention. Jenny tried to focus on her job, but she couldn't stop looking over at Mrs. Morris. She tried to shake it off, but there was something strange happening. She felt like she had missed something important, but she didn't know what. That's when it started to click. Mrs. Morris wasn't just any passenger. She wasn't just an old woman quietly waiting for a glass of water. There was something about her that set her apart. And Jenny was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, Mrs. Morris wasn't who she appeared to be. But Jenny wasn't the only one starting to notice. As the flight went on, more and more passengers began to whisper to each other. Jenny heard bits and pieces of their conversations as she passed by, and they didn't seem to be talking about the usual things like flight times or seat belts. No, she's definitely not just a regular passenger, one passenger said, her voice low. Didn't you hear her talking to the pilot when we boarded? She mentioned the weather like she already knew what was coming. Another passenger nodded, whispering back, and I swear I saw her talking to someone important in the airport lounge. She didn't look like a normal traveler at all. She looked like someone who's been around a lot. The whispers made Jenny stop in her tracks. Had she really been that clueless? How had she missed all of this? And why did it feel like everyone on the plane knew something she didn't? Jenny tried to shake it off, but it was clear that Mrs. Morris wasn't just a quiet elderly woman on a flight. She had an air of mystery about her, something that made her stand out from the rest of the passengers. And Jenny, caught in the whirlwind of her job and the pressure from Dave, hadn't even noticed it. The more Jenny thought about it, the more she realized that Mrs. Morris wasn't just another passenger. She had been sitting in her seat so quietly, so patiently, but there was something about her that made people look twice. And now, Jenny couldn't help but wonder, was there something she didn't know? Something about Mrs. Morris that was far bigger than she could have imagined? It wasn't just a hunch anymore. Something was off. And Jenny was starting to feel like she was caught in the middle of something she didn't fully understand. But what could she do? How could she fix this? Jenny moved down the aisle, trying her best to check on the passengers. Her mind was still racing after her talk with Dave. She knew she had made a mistake earlier when she ignored Mrs. Morris. She felt bad about it, but she couldn't help feeling like she had to do so much. The flight was busy, and she was just trying to keep up. But what had happened just now, was it really that big of a deal? As Jenny walked, she felt a strange shift in the air. It wasn't the usual noise of the plane. It wasn't the soft hum of the engines or the sound of passengers chatting. No, this time, everything felt different. There was a silence, a quiet that seemed to spread over the whole cabin. It made her skin prickle, and her heart raced for no reason at all. She glanced up and immediately noticed Mrs. Morris. The elderly woman, who had been sitting quietly all this time, was now sitting up straight in her seat. Her posture was perfect, almost like she had become taller, more confident in just a moment. She no longer looked like a simple old woman. There was something about her that felt powerful. Jenny's steps slowed as she passed Mrs. Morris' row. She didn't know why, but her feet just stopped moving. The world around her seemed to fade away, and she could only focus on Mrs. Morris. Mrs. Morris turned her head slowly, locking eyes with Jenny. For a moment, Jenny felt like the whole plane had disappeared, and all that was left was the two of them. Mrs. Morris' eyes were sharp and piercing. They didn't look old. They didn't look like a woman who had been quietly waiting for her water. No, these eyes looked like they could see through everything, like they could see straight into Jenny's soul. "Do you know who I am?" Mrs. Morris asked, her voice soft, but also full of something Jenny couldn't explain. There was authority in the way she spoke, like she wasn't just any passenger. No, she was someone important. Jenny could feel it. Jenny felt her throat dry up. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She couldn't speak. All she could think was how badly she had messed up earlier. She had ignored Mrs. Morris. She hadn't even offered her the water she had asked for. She had brushed her off like she didn't matter. But who was Mrs. Morris? Why was she asking such a strange question? And why did her voice sound so strong? No, Jenny finally stammered, her voice quiet and uncertain. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ignore you earlier. I didn't know." But before Jenny could finish, Mrs. Morris raised her hand, gently signaling for her to stop. There was no anger in her eyes, no harshness in her voice. It was as if she was calm, in control of everything. Slowly, almost like she was moving in slow motion, Mrs. Morris stood up. She wasn't shaky or frail like most people her age. No, she stood with a quiet strength, almost as if the entire plane was watching her, waiting for her next move. Jenny stepped back, feeling suddenly unsure of what to do. Mrs. Morris was no longer the quiet, frail woman she had dismissed earlier. Now, she seemed like someone who held power, real power, and Jenny had no idea where it came from. Mrs. Morris reached into her purse. It wasn't a fancy bag. It was simple, an old leather purse that looked well worn. She took out something and held it in her hand for a moment. Jenny stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Mrs. Morris' eyes never left hers, and there was no hint of kindness, no smile. Just steady, unwavering focus. Then, Mrs. Morris extended her hand toward Jenny. In her hand was a small, simple card. It wasn't like the flashy business cards Jenny had seen before. This one was simple, professional, with just a name and a title on it. Mrs. Morris held it out to Jenny, who took it without really thinking. Her hand shook a little as she accepted the card, her eyes wide in confusion. She looked down at the card, trying to make sense of it. The name on the card was Mrs. Evelyn Morris. But the title written below it made Jenny's stomach drop. "I own this airline." Jenny blinked. She didn't understand. She looked at the card again, then back up at Mrs. Morris, who was still looking at her with those sharp, knowing eyes. Jenny felt like the world had just tilted on its axis. The woman she had dismissed, the woman she had ignored, was not just a regular passenger. She wasn't an elderly woman who had been quietly waiting for her water. No, Mrs. Morris was the owner of the entire airline. Jenny could barely breathe. She was still staring at the card, trying to make sense of it. Was it some kind of joke? Was this a prank? But Mrs. Morris didn't seem like she was joking. She didn't look like she was waiting for Jenny to laugh. There was no smile, no wink. She was serious. The entire cabin felt like it was holding its breath. The passengers around Jenny, who had been quietly talking or reading their books before, were now watching the scene unfold in silence. Jenny felt like every single person on the plane was staring at her, waiting for her to say something. But what could she say? What could she possibly say when she had just learned that the woman she had completely ignored, who had asked for nothing except a simple glass of water, was the owner of the whole airline? Jenny's face flushed red. She felt like she could sink into the floor and disappear. She had been so focused on doing her job quickly that she hadn't even taken a moment to truly see who Mrs. Morris was. She hadn't treated her like she mattered. She hadn't treated her like she was important. And now, she was standing in front of the most important person on the entire plane. "Mrs. Morris," Jenny said quietly, her voice trembling. She didn't know what else to say. What could she say to make up for the mistake she had just made? But Mrs. Morris didn't seem angry. She didn't seem upset. She just nodded once, almost like she understood what Jenny was feeling. "You may have made a mistake," Mrs. Morris said calmly. "But the real question is whether you will learn from it. Will you see the value in every person you meet from now on? Because everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are. And if you learn that, Jenny, then you will truly be great at what you do." Jenny stood there, frozen. She had no idea how to respond. What could she say? What could she do to make this right? Mrs. Morris didn't wait for an answer. She simply turned and walked down the aisle, her steps confident, her back straight. Jenny watched her go, feeling like she had just witnessed something incredible. Mrs. Morris had not just taught her a lesson about respect. No, she had shown her a lesson about power, humility, and what it truly meant to treat others with dignity. As Jenny stood there, holding the business card in her hand, she knew her life would never be the same again. The flight continued, but for Jenny, nothing would ever feel quite the same. She had learned something important today, something that would stay with her forever. And it wasn't just about serving drinks or following orders. It was about seeing the value in every person you meet, no matter how ordinary they seem. Because sometimes, the most important people are the ones you least expect. As Mrs. Morris walked away from Jenny, the hum of the plane returned, but something had shifted. Jenny still stood in the middle of the aisle, staring down at the small business card in her hand. Her heart was pounding. She had been trained to provide excellent customer service, to serve everyone with a smile, but this was different. She had just learned a lesson that she would never forget. Jenny felt a wave of embarrassment flood over her. How could she have been so blind? How could she have been so dismissive to someone who was so much more than she had thought? Mrs. Morris was not just another elderly woman. She was someone with real power, someone who could change everything in an instant. And she had done so without raising her voice, without causing a scene. She had simply spoken 3 words that would echo in Jenny's mind forever: "I own this airline." Jenny slowly made her way to the back of the plane, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the seatbacks for support. She passed by the other flight attendants, who were still busy with their tasks, but their eyes flickered to her, their curiosity obvious. It was clear that something had changed. Something had happened, and Jenny wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. Her supervisor, Dave, was standing near the galley, talking to another flight attendant. He glanced up as Jenny approached. His face was stern, and his arms were crossed. She could already tell he had been watching her closely. She wasn't sure what to expect from him, but she knew one thing: she had already disappointed him once today. "Jenny," Dave said, his tone flat. "I need you to focus. No distractions. Get it together." Jenny didn't reply at first. She just stood there, the business card clutched tightly in her hand. She could feel her mind racing. She wasn't sure if she should say anything about Mrs. Morris. Should she tell him what had just happened? Would he believe her? Would anyone believe her? Before she could gather her thoughts, Dave spoke again. You've got to be better than this. We're not here to play games. Jenny blinked, still feeling the weight of the moment. She was still trying to process everything that had just happened. But one thing was clear, she couldn't keep ignoring the bigger picture. Mrs. Morris wasn't just an ordinary passenger. Jenny had made a mistake, but she had learned something important. Now, she had to face the consequences of that mistake. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could control how she moved forward. As she walked back down the aisle, her mind was swirling with thoughts of Mrs. Morris. Jenny felt as if she had learned a powerful lesson in a matter of minutes, something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. It wasn't just about serving drinks or helping passengers. It was about seeing the worth in everyone, no matter how small or insignificant they might seem. The flight continued, and Jenny did her best to focus on the task at hand. She tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that lingered in the air, but it was impossible. Every time she walked past a passenger or checked on someone, she couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Morris. She couldn't stop wondering what she would have done differently if she had known who she was. By the time the plane started its descent, Jenny had made up her mind. She was going to find a way to apologize to Mrs. Morris. She didn't know if it would change anything, but she needed to. She had to make it right. There was no way she could just let this moment slip away, never to be acknowledged. The plane began to touch down, and the flight attendants started to prepare for landing. But Jenny's mind was still racing. She went through the motions of securing the cabin, checking that seat belts were fastened and tray tables were up. She moved mechanically, her mind far away from the tasks at hand. She couldn't help but replay the moment over and over again in her mind. She kept hearing Mrs. Morris' calm voice in her head, "I own this airline." Was that why Jenny had been so quick to dismiss her? Was it because she had underestimated her? Was it because she had assumed that someone like Mrs. Morris, an older woman traveling alone, didn't matter as much as the younger, more active passengers? Jenny had to admit that she had fallen into that trap. She had allowed herself to become so caught up in the chaos of the flight that she had forgotten the most important thing: every passenger mattered. When the plane finally landed and the seatbelt sign was turned off, Jenny took a deep breath. She knew what she had to do. She made her way to the front of the cabin and found Mrs. Morris sitting quietly, just as she had before. But this time, there was a different energy about her. Mrs. Morris wasn't just waiting for her luggage or preparing to exit the plane. She was sitting there, calm, composed, and still holding an air of quiet authority. Jenny stood for a moment, unsure of how to approach her. She didn't want to make things worse, but she couldn't just walk away without saying something. After all, Mrs. Morris had already taught her one of the most important lessons of her life, without saying much at all. Taking a deep breath, Jenny finally walked over to Mrs. Morris' seat. "Mrs. Morris," Jenny began, her voice trembling slightly. "I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. I didn't know who you were. I didn't realize how important you are." Mrs. Morris looked up at her, and for a moment, Jenny thought she saw a slight smile tug at the corner of her lips. "It's not about me," Mrs. Morris said softly. "It's about how you treat people. We all deserve respect, no matter who we are." Jenny nodded, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. She wasn't sure if Mrs. Morris had forgiven her, but at least she had acknowledged her mistake. And that, in itself, felt like a small victory. As Jenny helped passengers off the plane, her mind was still focused on the conversation with Mrs. Morris. She had learned something today that she would never forget. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about seeing the humanity in every person she encountered. No one was more important than anyone else. Everyone deserved to be treated with kindness and respect, no matter who they were or what they looked like. Jenny's day ended, but the lesson she had learned from Mrs. Morris stayed with her. It would guide her in everything she did from that day forward. She couldn't undo the mistake she had made, but she could choose to be better from here on out. And as for Mrs. Morris, well, she wasn't just any passenger. She was a reminder that appearances could be deceiving. The world was full of people with hidden power, and sometimes, the most important people were the ones you least expected. As Jenny left the airport that day, she couldn't help but feel grateful for the unexpected lesson. It wasn't the kind of lesson she had expected to learn on a simple flight, but it was the kind that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Every person she met from now on would be seen for who they truly were, not by their age, their appearance, or their outward circumstances, but by the simple fact that they were human. And that was all that mattered. The air in the plane felt thick with tension as Mrs. Morris stood there, her eyes unwavering. She was no longer the frail old woman everyone had thought she was. Instead, she carried an authority that seemed to freeze everyone in place. Jenny felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she couldn't look away. It was as if Mrs. Morris had just transformed before her eyes into someone completely different. Jenny had never felt so small. She was just doing her job, trying to keep up with all the passengers and their needs. But now, it felt like her whole world had just flipped upside down. She hadn't realized how much she had taken things for granted. She had been rushing, looking only at the surface, and she had overlooked someone who was clearly much more important than she could ever have imagined. Jenny's stomach twisted with regret. She had ignored the most important rule of all: never judge someone by their appearance. It wasn't just about serving drinks and snacks, or making sure passengers had what they needed. It was about respect. It was about understanding that every person had value, no matter who they were or how they looked. Mrs. Morris's calm voice broke the silence once again. "Jenny, I think you might want to start looking for another job," she said. Her words were soft, but they carried a weight that made Jenny's knees feel weak. "I don't tolerate disrespect, especially when it's aimed at people who are loyal to this company." Jenny's heart sank. Her job, the thing she had worked so hard for, was slipping away right in front of her eyes. She couldn't even defend herself. What could she say? She had made a huge mistake, and she knew it. The reality of the situation hit her like a cold wave. She had let her own judgment cloud her actions, and now she was paying the price. As security walked onto the plane, the passengers around them watched in shock. Some were whispering to each other, while others simply stared, unable to believe what was happening. Jenny had been caught in the act of making a terrible mistake, and she was about to face the consequences. But it wasn't just about her job. It was about something much bigger. It was about understanding the importance of seeing people for who they truly were, rather than making assumptions based on what they looked like. Jenny felt a knot tighten in her throat as she was escorted off the plane by the security team. She tried to walk calmly, but her legs felt like jelly beneath her. The other flight attendants, who had been busy with their own tasks, now stood silently, watching the scene unfold. Jenny could feel their eyes on her, and it was clear that they, too, were shocked by what had just happened. They had seen her make mistakes before, but this was something entirely different. This was a moment of reckoning. The other passengers, too, had been witnesses to the unfolding drama. Some of them stared at Jenny with surprise, while others looked at her with judgment. The realization hit them all at once: they had all been part of a situation that had revealed something they never would have expected. Mrs. Morris wasn't just another passenger. She was someone with the power to make decisions that could change everything. She was someone who had the ability to make even the most experienced flight attendants stop in their tracks. As Jenny left the plane, she felt a mix of emotions. She was humiliated, yes, but there was also a part of her that felt something else. There was a strange sense of understanding creeping in. She had learned a painful lesson, but it was a lesson that would stay with her forever. She had learned that you should never judge someone by their age, their appearance, or their outward circumstances. Everyone has a story, and sometimes, that story is far more important than what you see on the surface. As the plane doors closed and the other passengers began to gather their belongings, there was a strange silence that hung in the air. It wasn't just about Jenny anymore. It was about the powerful reminder that Mrs. Morris had just given to everyone on that flight. People looked around at each other, unsure of what to say. They had just witnessed something that would change the way they saw the world. Back inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. The passengers no longer looked at each other in the same way. There was a sense of shared understanding, as if the events that had just unfolded had taught them all something important. Mrs. Morris had shown them the truth not just about Jenny, but about the way people can be so easily underestimated. It was a hard lesson, but it was one that everyone on that plane would carry with them from that day forward. As the plane taxied to the gate and the engines powered down, the flight attendants resumed their work. But this time, there was a new air of respect and attentiveness among them. They had seen what had happened, and they knew it was a lesson they would never forget. For Jenny, though, the lesson was just beginning. She would have to face the consequences of her actions, but she also knew that she had been given a chance to change. She had been given a wake-up call, a moment that would make her a better person, a better employee, and a better human being. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. The days that followed were difficult for Jenny. She had lost her job, and her pride had been wounded. But there was something inside her that knew she could learn from this experience. It wasn't just about the mistake she had made. It was about how she could grow from it. Jenny spent the next few weeks reflecting on her actions. She thought about how easy it had been to dismiss someone based on their appearance. She had been so focused on the job, so worried about pleasing her supervisor and keeping up with the hectic pace of the flight, that she had forgotten the most important part of her work, treating people with kindness and respect. Jenny knew that she had a long way to go before she could redeem herself, but she was ready to start. She reached out to the airline, asking if there was any way to make amends. She wanted to prove that she had learned her lesson and that she was willing to work hard to earn back her place. She didn't expect them to take her back, but she had to try. She had to show that she was capable of change. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. Jenny was given a second chance. The airline recognized her sincerity and her willingness to learn from her mistake. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but Jenny slowly earned back the trust of her colleagues and the passengers she served. It wasn't just about getting her job back. It was about becoming a better person, someone who saw the value in every person she encountered. As for Mrs. Morris, she continued to fly on the airline, but Jenny never forgot the lesson she had taught her. Every time Jenny passed her in the cabin, she made sure to treat her with the respect she deserved. And when the other passengers saw how Jenny had grown, they too learned something valuable, that true strength lies in treating others with kindness, no matter who they are. Jenny's journey didn't end with her return to the airline. It was a journey that continued to shape her, both as an employee and as a person. She learned that life has a way of teaching you lessons when you least expect it. And sometimes, those lessons come in the form of a seemingly simple moment that changes everything. Mrs. Morris, the quiet woman who had once seemed so ordinary, had shown Jenny a truth that was more powerful than anything she had ever known, that respect is earned through actions, not appearances. No one is ever truly ordinary, and everyone deserves to be treated with kindness. As Jenny moved forward in her life and career, she never forgot the lesson she had learned that day. It shaped the way she viewed the world, and it influenced the way she treated everyone she met. And that was the real justice, the transformation of a life, the change that came from a lesson learned the hard way. Sometimes, in life, the quietest person in the room holds the most power. Think about it. We've all been there, right? We look at someone and immediately make a guess about who they are, what they're capable of, or even what their life is like. But what if we're wrong? What if the person we least expect is the one who surprises us? Mrs. Morris was a perfect example of this. To most people, she was just an elderly woman sitting quietly in her seat. But little did anyone know, she was so much more than that. She wasn't just an old lady. She was a person with a story, a person with power and influence, and someone who knew exactly how to use that power when the time came. Now, let's take a moment to think about how quickly we judge others. Maybe you've done it too. You look at someone and immediately think, oh, they're just this, or they're not important enough to pay attention to. But here's the truth, those snap judgments are often wrong. They miss the deeper, richer story behind every person. And that's the lesson here. Jenny learned it the hard way, and so did the rest of the passengers on that flight. Everyone was too busy to notice Mrs. Morris. They were rushing through their day, trying to meet their own needs, their own expectations. But by the time they realized who she was, it was already too late. Jenny had lost her job, and the others had seen how a quick, thoughtless action could change everything. But that doesn't mean Jenny couldn't change. And it doesn't mean that we can't learn from moments like this. The truth is, life will always throw us challenges, and sometimes we might make mistakes. Jenny did. But what makes a person truly strong isn't how many mistakes they make, it's how they handle those mistakes. It's how they learn from them and grow stronger. And that's what makes us all better, kinder people. So, let's make a promise to ourselves. Let's promise that we will never underestimate anyone. We don't know the full story of anyone's life. The quiet, gentle woman sitting next to us on the bus or the shy man standing behind us in line might be the person who changes our future in ways we never saw coming. Remember, it's easy to ignore people. It's easy to look at someone and think, they don't matter to me. But those are the very people who might just be the most important. So next time, take a closer look. Treat everyone with respect, no matter who they are, no matter how quiet or simple they may seem. You never know when someone might surprise you, when someone who looks ordinary might hold the key to something special in your life. Never forget, the person you ignore today could be the one who opens a door for you tomorrow. In the end, this story isn't just about Mrs. Morris or Jenny. It's about how we treat each other every day. The small, simple moments of kindness or care can change lives. And when we open our hearts to others, when we see them for who they truly are, we begin to build a world that's kinder, stronger, and more understanding. So, the next time you meet someone, whether it's at school, work, or anywhere, remember Mrs. Morris. Remember how one small action, a simple mistake, turned into a big lesson. You might not always see what someone is capable of at first glance, but if you keep an open mind, you might just find out that they have the power to make a difference. And who knows? Maybe one day, you'll be the one who surprises others in the best way possible, just like Mrs. Morris did. Sometimes, we underestimate others. It's easy to do. We judge someone based on how they look, how they speak, or where they're from. We think we know them because we only see a small piece of their life. But the truth is, every person carries a story that we might not see at first. And that story can be more powerful than we can ever imagine. Think about it. Mrs. Morris was sitting there on that plane, quietly waiting for her water, with no one giving her a second glance. She didn't demand attention. She didn't shout or ask for special treatment. She simply sat there, observing, watching the world around her. Most people would have passed her by without giving her a thought. After all, she looked like just another elderly woman who probably didn't need anything extra. But that was the mistake Jenny made. She saw Mrs. Morris as just another person to skip over. And it wasn't because Jenny was mean. It wasn't because she had bad intentions. It was because Jenny, like many of us, was caught up in her own world. She was trying to keep up with the busy flight, rushing to serve all the passengers. In that moment, she made a choice not to give attention to Mrs. Morris. She decided that Mrs. Morris didn't matter as much as the others. And that small, careless decision cost her everything. But here's the thing, Jenny wasn't a bad person. She wasn't trying to hurt anyone. She simply made a mistake. And that mistake opened her eyes to something much bigger. It reminded us all that we can never judge people based on their appearance. We don't know what they've been through, or what they might do for us when we least expect it. So let's step back for a moment. Think about your own life. How often do you look at someone and assume you know who they are? Maybe it's the quiet kid in your class, or the older man sitting alone on the park bench. You might think, oh, they're just old, or they don't look like they need anything. But are we truly seeing them for who they are? Or are we seeing them based on our own limited understanding? Mrs. Morris taught us a powerful lesson: appearances can be deceiving. You can never tell who someone really is by looking at them. That's why it's so important to treat everyone with kindness and respect. We might never know if the person we're talking to today will be the person who helps us tomorrow. Now, let's think about the lesson Jenny learned. She made a mistake. She didn't see Mrs. Morris for who she really was. But the moment Mrs. Morris revealed her true identity, everything changed. Jenny felt a deep sense of embarrassment, but more than that, she felt a new sense of respect for everyone around her. She realized that she couldn't go through life thinking she knew everything about people just by looking at them. Every person has something valuable to offer, and we have to be open to seeing that. And let's not forget about Mrs. Morris. She wasn't angry. She didn't scream or yell at Jenny. She simply stood up, calmly explained who she was, and let her actions speak for themselves. That's a powerful way to handle situations: quiet strength, wisdom, and patience. Mrs. Morris didn't have to shout or demand respect. She let her true nature shine through in her actions. So, what can we learn from all of this? First, we learn that it's important to treat everyone equally. We don't know who they are or what they can do. Every person deserves to be treated with respect and kindness. And even though we all make mistakes like Jenny did, we can learn from them. It's how we grow as people. Jenny's mistake led her to a powerful realization, one that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. But the story doesn't just stop there. The lesson is also about humility. It's about realizing that we're all human, and we all have our weaknesses. Sometimes, we can be so caught up in our own world that we forget to see others for who they truly are. It's important to take a step back, look around, and be aware of the people we might be overlooking. We might miss an opportunity to connect with someone special or to learn something important. We also learn the importance of second chances. Jenny made a mistake, but that didn't mean she was a bad person. It just meant that she needed to learn and grow. And just like Jenny, we all have room to grow. Life is full of lessons, and every day gives us a new chance to improve and be better than we were yesterday. Another key part of this story is understanding the value of wisdom. Mrs. Morris didn't need to shout or demand respect. She didn't need to make a scene. She was wise enough to know that real power comes from within. It comes from staying calm, collected, and in control of your emotions. That's something we can all learn from. In times of stress or conflict, we can choose to stay calm and act with dignity, just like Mrs. Morris did. Her quiet confidence was far more powerful than any loud or aggressive action could ever be. And let's not forget that this story teaches us the value of empathy. When we stop judging others and start trying to understand their experiences, we can make better decisions. We can connect with people on a deeper level and offer them the kindness they deserve. This is how we build stronger relationships with others, by truly seeing them for who they are, not just who we think they are. As we reflect on this story, let's ask ourselves, are we willing to look beyond the surface? Are we willing to treat others with respect, even when we don't understand them fully? Are we ready to learn from our mistakes, and to grow as people every single day? It's easy to judge, but it takes strength and wisdom to be kind to everyone, regardless of their age, appearance, or background. And when we do that, we become better people. We make the world a better place, one small act of kindness at a time. So, the next time you're in a situation where you might overlook someone, whether it's a classmate, a neighbor, or even a stranger, think about Mrs. Morris. Remember how her quiet strength changed everything. And remember how, when you least expect it, the person you might ignore could be the one who holds the key to something important in your life. The truth is, you never know who the people around you really are. They might just surprise you in ways you can't imagine. And that's the beauty of life. Everyone has a story, a lesson, and a piece of wisdom to share. And when you open your heart to others, you open yourself up to a world of possibilities. So, let's all remember this lesson: never underestimate anyone. Treat everyone with kindness and respect, because you never know when the quiet person next to you might just change your life.